Okay, great. Thank you so
Yeah,
much, Karina,
welcome.
for the introduction. It's an honor and pleasure to be here with people to talk about climate change and health. I guess a little introduction. I am a rising second year PhD student in environmental health at Harvard T.H. School of Public Health. I grew up in Shanghai, China, and spent the first half of my life there with my family. And for the past decade, I was in the US. I was initially in California, and now I'm in Boston, Massachusetts, finishing my education program. My research interest is in the population health of climate change, primarily looking at heat exposure and adolescent mental health. But personally, I got interested in just the human environment relationship growing up because there was a lot of media coverage about air pollution. I remember my parents asked me to wear a mask going out on my way to school, and I was very annoyed. I did not want to do that. But that left an impression, which led me to do my undergraduate degree in environmental studies that kind of explores the different impact of climate change on economics, on policy, sociology, and which led me to where I am right now in environmental health, because as we explore the science behind climate change, I think it was a little bit disheartening on the fact that, at least in the US, there are people that either don't recognize climate change or don't see climate change or climate action as urgent as I hope people would think in that way. And I found that human health is actually a very motivating factor to help people understand the impact, because that's how people can feel. It's not the narratives about, oh, the polar bears are losing their home. It's about how people's lived experience could really inform their perspective. So that led me to pursue a degree in environmental health, which is a subsection in public health. And today I'm very excited to kind of talk about what I've learned so far and give you a 3,000-meter overview of what is out there. And I'm hoping that by giving you this information, you're able to kind of identify key issues that you might want to incorporate, thinking about your project, your academic training, or your career, and think about how these tools can really help you either frame your message and give people more perspectives on how climate change impact people's life, as well as what we can do with it. So again, the goal is a very broad overview. I'm going to give you some stats and some academic papers to back up my claim, just so you know I'm not lying, I'm not making things up. But we don't expect you to be reciting any of this. This is more for you to kind of identify the link and kind of make it intuitive sense of the connection, and kind of give you an idea of how things work through the chain of cause and effect, and how that could lead you to where your project can incorporate that aspect into the things that you want to do. So a rapid fire overview of climate change is characterized by changing temperature and precipitation patterns, and that also leads to kind of this shifting storm season, either in terms of geological coverage. So you will see storms of higher intensity and higher frequency and duration going to places that they don't really hit before. And you will also see kind of more intense storm for areas that previously were cyclone or like natural disaster prone, but didn't really see events of that magnitude. So this graph is a very helpful graph to kind of structure what we are going to go through today. It's a very broad overview. And so I bucket them into three bigger sections so we can kind of navigate through them one by one. So the first big section is in the increase in exposure. As I briefly touched upon before, you see the changing patterns of temperature, which lead to extreme temperature events. You have severe weather and natural disaster events. You have increase in air pollution, which has a very interesting impact in climate change, because people talk about them almost kind of interchangeably, but the interconnected connected between the two are in a way fascinating and scary at the same time. And lastly, allergen. I'm not gonna really go into allergen as much, because the research findings on it is a little bit not really subtle, but the general idea is that you will expect increased amount of allergen, which will trigger more respiratory diseases and asthma. And then the second big bucket would be the exacerbation of adverse health outcomes that is gonna be vector-borne diseases like malaria, dengue, Zika virus, and some other things, as well as waterborne diseases that are mostly related with sanitation and like WASH program. And lastly, the interaction with the existing health issue that is climate change and food insecurity and agriculture, as well as climate change and migration and displacement. Okay, so before we dive into this individual topics, I do want to highlight the equity principles as we think about the climate and health connections, because you will see that despite climate change being a global issue, it has very local implications that will lead to different issues that might be interesting or relevant for your communities, but you will also have people within that communities being disproportionately impacted, whether because they are more likely to be exposed to all the hazards that I briefly touched upon, or because either their physiological vulnerability, their socioeconomic status make them more at risk of the adverse impact of these exposure. So I'm gonna highlight several vulnerable subpopulation for some of the topics, and I want you to kind of think about it throughout this presentation to see if you identify any of the factors that either you see in your communities that might be either protective or harmful for people when exposed to climate hazard, and what are some of the things that people do to kind of protect themselves from when they are at elevated risks. Okay, the first thing is on extreme heat exposure. I think it's no doubt that a lot of us feel like the years are getting warmer and warmer, and especially I am in Boston, Massachusetts, where the cities are kind of old. You don't really have a lot of residential buildings with AC because people didn't really need that. And but for the most recent years, you see higher and higher temperature, and people start to struggle and realize that they need more cooling strategies as we deal with the increasing heat. And I do want to highlight here that like when we talk about heat, people's mind kind of go into temperature, but it is an interplay between temperature and humidity, because even at the same temperature, let's say 30 degrees Celsius, you have kind of like your dry area versus the humid area, you will feel differently. And that will really inform like your physiological response, as well as just like your mental stress when dealing with it. So I kind of give you a list of these measures that people explored on how these different measures would impact people's health, but there's really no settled like gold standard measures to kind of measure heat, because those are very local, like regionally different. So that would be something that might be interesting for people who want to think about what would be the most relevant for their community when we think about heat. And overall, heat exposure has been linked to heat stroke, which is pretty self-explanatory. You have dehydration and then excessive stress on your body, and then people start to feel nauseous and maybe need acute healthcare to kind of recover. And you will also see increased incidence of heart attacks related to heat, and also kidney failure, which kind of goes back to the problem with dehydration. You have asthma exacerbation, decreased mental well-being, and even more incidence of death, as you see from hospital record, that you see more mortality count immediately following a kind of like a heat event in that region. So one thing I want to highlight that the idea of, as I kind of alluded to before, the idea of heat is very local context dependent. So what is considered hot in the Netherlands would not be considered hot in India. And so this kind of figure on the right is a pretty groundbreaking paper in the field that kind of looks at the temperature and mortality relationships in different countries. So one examples that I will pull out would be this top graph that is for Sydney, Australia. So all the subgraphs here have an x-axis for temperature. Oh, sorry. For temperature in degrees Celsius, and then the y-axis are relative risk. So relative risk of one is is like null, is like it does not have any impact. Above one means harmful impact, and below one means protective. And you see that like in Sydney, the kind of the most frequently observed temperature will be around 20 degrees Celsius versus for Bangkok, Thailand, their mean is 30 degrees Celsius. So the average in Thailand would be considered a extreme heat in Sydney, Australia, which kind of points to the direction that population in kind of like less tropical temperate region might be able to acclimate to hotter climate by adapting strategies that is currently used by people in the tropical regions. And there is potential for people in the tropical region to kind of identify additional cooling strategies to counter the health impact. But there is a physiological tolerance limit among individuals. When you see more news about record-breaking heat in India, in the Middle East, when you have temperature like above 40 or 50, even 50 degrees Celsius, those start to become like in a way unimaginable and almost make the place not as habitable. And that is which means it is crucial for people to kind of identify what are proper kind of strategies to protect yourself from these excessive heat event. And beyond the different level exposure to heat on the global scale, you also have difference on the local scale when you think about when you think about phenomena like the urban heat island effect. Basically, urban areas is associated with decreased vegetation cover and increase in heat absorbing surfaces because of the concrete or the asphalt on the road, and those really elevated the temperature for people in living in that in that area. Research has shown that for even within urban areas, places with green space coverage, whether it's parks, green roofs, or like tree canopy coverage along the street, can really make a difference of almost 4 degrees Celsius for the block next to it that doesn't have any of that. So that really highlights another way of identifying strategies and looking at where people are at the most risk and what can be done to counter these adverse health impacts that we kind of talked about before. And for population vulnerable to heat, you have infant and children, pregnant women, and older adults who tend to have I don't want to say compromised physiological ability, but they don't really have that ability to properly cope with that because of their health status or where they're going through. So those are kind of key population to make sure that people either stay in shade, stay hydrated, and make sure that you have people to check on those vulnerable population in these kind of extreme conditions. And another group that is at elevated risk is actually outdoor workers. And one example is the migrant workers in the Gulf state. This has been coming under increased scrutiny because of the 2022 FIFA World Cup in Qatar and also COP28 in the United Arab Emirates in 2023. Some nonprofit organizations have interviewed migrant workers in the Gulf state who reported often experiencing symptoms of heat-related illnesses, including like fainting, vomiting on the job, but they have very limited access to relief measures. Like they don't have shaded area on the job site. They don't really have hydration, like proper sources of hydration as they work in this very dangerous condition that would not only have direct health impact and also make them more prone to job-related injuries from falling or just injury from the equipment. And current research has shown that despite the so-called midday work ban, where technically people are not allowed to work from noon to 3 to avoid the heat, those conditions don't really those rules aren't really relevant for this population because your heat exposure at 2:59 p.m. does not change immediately at 3:01, and the standard that doesn't really take account into the actual temperature and humidity condition really put people in and very unsafe conditions. And this is, as you see more increased incidents, this is very alarming, as generally migrant workers are able-bodied men who we generally would believe that they are at a better health state, but because of this excessive exposure, it make them incredibly vulnerable and at very high risk for these conditions. And in addition to kind of the direct health impact, I talk about heat event can also have indirect health effects through power outage. When you see when it's a very hot day, you see electricity demand surges, but the supply side also kind of have more challenges because transmission capacity will go down. Basically, electricity transfers were transmitted through these wire metal conductors, and metal conductors expands under heat, and carrying more power because of the higher demand would also heat up the wire itself, and those higher temperature will cause a line to droop and make contact with the organic matters on the ground, which would lead to short circuit and power outage. And another challenge with that would be that you have what just because of physics, right? When you have hotter temperature, you have more power loss during transmission as the electricity goes through the conductor. So the peak in the demand and the challenges in the supply really can cause major power outage that challenges people, that kind of stops people from having access to air, from using air conditioning in hot in like hot weathers. And this has been observed at multiple countries just within the past 3 years. You have this news headline from the BBC regarding the heat event in Delhi in the summer of 2024, and then in Bangladesh, as well as 4 Balkan countries in the early summer of 2023. And those are just a glimpse of what has been reported. There are also this practice called load shedding, and basically some government would plan power outage during foreseeable heat event to kind of temper this mismatch between supply and demand, and those can still be very challenging to for people that really need those cooling strategies in very hot conditions. And another indirect effect of heat would be through disruption in healthcare delivery. As I just said, you will see more people visiting hospital during or kind of immediately after a heat event, and those would overwhelm the healthcare facility, especially when you don't have as many beds or like doctors, nurses to the people who need their attention and care. And in this very high pressure, time sensitive circumstance, the healthcare providers will need to make these resource allocation decisions very quickly, and those often don't really lead to the best health outcomes for patients. In a city in Mexico, people found that hospital overcrowding can lead to early discharge and denied hospital admission, which are often followed by higher mortality rate and worsening health outcomes, even for patients whose condition are not really related to heat exposure, but they were either kind of sent home early or turned away because the hospital are just not able to handle these surges of visits. And next, we're gonna briefly talk about natural disasters. These are kind of these are also well, when people talk about extreme weather events, our mind usually goes through natural disasters like tropical cyclones, flooding, drought, wildfire, and dust storm. Although technically heat could also be categorized as extreme weather events. So the physical health implications of these events can be different just because of the different pathways. For example, for flooding and tropical cyclone, you immediately during the event, you might see drowning or people being taken away by the weather. But after the event, you might also see more mold and therefore mold-induced respiratory responses as people try to recover and go back to to their original residence after the event, during wildfire, or after even like a month after the wildfire event, you might see elevated air pollution level that would trigger people's CVD, respiratory outcome, and also might have some more long-term effect that people are still trying to figure out at this point, and similarly for dust storm. But regardless of what kind of physical health manifestation, the experience of natural disasters, of any natural disaster itself, could also have major mental health toll on people. Research have repeatedly shown that people who have experienced like traumatic natural disaster event related to evacuation, loss of family, friends, property, are at increased risk of depression, anxiety, and PTSD. But I do want to flag that a lot of times these studies are for isolated events, for a specific hurricane, for a specific wildfire event. But in this way, there hasn't really been a lot of research that directly attributes the amount, the proportion of mental health burden to climate-induced extreme weather, climate-induced natural disaster, just because the attribution science of these things have not really been settled. But given we know that the change in temperature and precipitation pattern would lead to increased frequency and duration of these events, we would expect an increase in the physical and mental health toll related to these. And next, we're going to talk about air pollution. Currently, air pollution is responsible for approximately 7 million premature deaths per year. And the major pollutants include particulate matter of different diameters, of different sizes. So the subscript here are kind of indicating the size of the particulate matter. You have nitrogen oxides and the sulfur dioxide. Those are kind of the three most regulated pollutants, although for specific sectors, you might see specific toxins related to the activities there. So some of the sources are pictured here. You have industrial activity, traffic. This is more for household. The pictures here is more for household air pollution that comes from burning of biofuels that disproportionately impact women and children because they tend to stay at home more when the husband or the head of household will go out to work, and these poorly ventilated housing condition and these relatively inefficient fuel really exposed them to these respiratory stressor. And you have urban burning of landfill, and then also some agriculture activity that release different type of pollutants. So as I kind of building upon what we just go through, the sources of air pollution differ by sector, but it's interesting to see that the leading cause of the major pollutants like transportation and energy generation are also leading contributors to greenhouse gas emission. So I want to be very clear that air pollution and climate change share major causes by sector, like and also in addition, like industrial activities, which make them kind of the evil twin kids of burning of fossil fuels. But in addition to shared major causes by sector, you also see air pollution being amplified by climate change. So one example is the formation of ground level ozone. So for kind of traffic related air pollution, you see emission of nitrous oxides and volatile organic compounds. And when these two are in the atmosphere and they are exposed to heat and sunlight, they form ground level ozone. So when ozone is far away, they're good because they filter out the UV radiation, they protect people from skin cancer. The ground level ozones are bad because they can trigger respiratory responses and also just are kind of associated with the smog, and increased heat means there will be increased air pollution as well, in addition to the fact that the causes of climate change also cause air pollution. And another way to think about exacerbation of air pollution is the fact that you will expect longer wildfire season due to climate change, and those can lead to more air pollution that is like particularly matter, or if the wildfire encroaches upon more kind of human settlement, you see some more rare toxins that you don't usually get released into the air, but because they burn through like houses and people's like properties and whatever they have, you kind of have a lot more plastic burning related toxin that was gonna like kind of linger around until people are able to either use air purifier or just wait long enough for them to go away. So the health effects of air pollution can be somewhat similar to heat exposure, although I would say that we know, like I think the scientists and researchers are pretty much they are pretty certain that air pollution are deadly and they are bad for your health. Although the exact biological mechanism are still like being explored. Someone in my department is working on it right now, so I'm more than happy to kind of share the more details if people are interested afterward. And but the major causes of mortality and morbidity related to air pollution manifest through cardiovascular diseases like stroke, myocardial infarction, and hypertension, and then respiratory diseases like asthma, COPD, chronic bronchitis. You might also see increase in cancer incidence, but those studies need a little bit longer kind of follow-up time to really make certain. And then for pregnant people who are exposed to elevated air pollution level, you also expect to see more incidences of low birth weight and preterm birth, as well as pregnancy induced hypertension for the mothers. And lastly, there's the emerging research on the fact that being exposed to air pollution can increase your risk for Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. But again, ongoing research that people are still trying to figure out with more diverse data set across the world. So as I kind of briefly touched upon before, the population at risk to ambient air pollution would be kind of children, pregnant people, older adults, as well as people with pre-existing respiratory conditions that will be kind of exacerbated and triggered and due to high air pollution level. But you also see people with higher than average exposure being at risk. You tend to see a good amount of residential communities near major roadways because it's transit accessible and people want to be able to kind of like navigate the area around easily. And or also like schools that are located near major roadways. So for people who are kind of interested in climate change, air pollution, and health, I guess I'm wondering if you could identify either identify with this or like your friends who might be exposed and kind of think about what are ways that people can be made aware of it, and also what are things that people can do to protect themselves from it, and also more occupational related exposure like street vendors and traffic conductors. There are several studies in kind of sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia that particularly look at this population that really reveals their elevated risks of cardiovascular disease. And those often are people that may or may not have health insurance and need some additional attention for effective intervention in this way. And now we're gonna move on to the more outcome-oriented topics. So first is vector-borne diseases. So vector-borne disease is an interaction between a pathogen, a vector, and a host. So a vector is a living organism that transmits infectious pathogens and parasite from an infected animal or human to another. So in this way, human or the animal will be the host, and then a common vector will be like a mosquito, flies, ticks, and etc. And the transmission cycle of vector-borne disease can really differ by the pathogen and like the vector. But the general idea, for example, for malaria would be you have a mosquito that bite on someone who's infected that made their you have a mosquito that bite that carries the pathogen for malaria that infects the person that it bit. And the infected liver would ultimately lead to the infected blood cell enter the bloodstream. And when you have another mosquito that feed on this infected person, this mosquito would then be a disease carrying vector that then spread malaria pathogens in the population. And similarly for dengue, you see mosquito. I'm gonna say that mosquito is kind of one of the more well-studied vector compared to ticks or like other species, but basically it fed on someone who's infected, and then the pathogen, I mean, for dengue, it will be a virus, replicates in the mosquito and travels to the mosquito salivary glands, which may the next bite of that mosquito infectious that and a mosquito can infect multiple people throughout its life cycle and kind of leads to spread of this vector-borne disease as well. So the climate-driven vector-borne disease is primarily acted through the impact on the habitat of vectors and then the impact on human settlement. So changing temperature and precipitation pattern kind of opens up new habitat for some of the vectors, while kind of for some old vectors to migrate to the new, more inhabitable area. And this will lead to increased incidence of infectious diseases in this new area because people were previously unexposed. So they were not really immune and their body don't really know what to do with it. So you're gonna see a spike in outbreaks as the vectors move to this new region. And the spike, depending on the disease, the elevated disease count might remain for like several years or even decades until people kind of figure out how to adapt to it, whether it's through more disease surveillance or more disease control method, or later as they kind of, I think the physiological adaptation kind of takes a little bit longer than that. But at the same time, climate variables can also have impact on human that make them more susceptible to infectious disease, to vector-borne diseases because of the economic impact or lack of access to nutrition, just to make them more likely to either interact with this new vector or make the because of their kind of more compromised health status, make them more vulnerable to be infected. So here are some of the examples of the climate sensitive disease and health impact. I think for time's sake, I'm not gonna, I have 4 examples, but I'm not gonna go into each one of them. But if you just look at malaria, because this is probably one of the most well-studied vector-borne diseases out there, given the funding are primarily looking at malaria right now. So generally, without disease control or socio-economic development, the spatial and temporal risk of malaria is largely governed by rainfall, temperature, and humidity. And one example of kind of this opening up of new habitat would be observed in the Ethiopian highlands, where a temperature increase of 0.2 degrees Celsius per decade have exposed a growing population of non-immune persons to the risk of malaria during the past 3 decades. And in addition to this new kind of like the new frontier of malaria, you also have deteriorating public health infrastructure in the previously somewhat like in region that had public health infrastructure that is no longer working as well, and make people kind of more likely to still get infected in this way. And some other examples of disease will be dengue and Zika virus, Lyme disease, and West Nile virus. If people are interested, I can share the presentation with Karina later, and then you can kind of read up more about it. There's like a really amazing paper from the New England Journal of Medicine that gives you a very detailed overview that specifically look at climate change and vector-borne diseases, if that is something that you're interested in as well.
We only have 5 minutes left. We have to finish on time because there's a francophone cohort using our Zoom. Maybe could you do mental health really briefly, and then we'll have to end the session, and then I'll discuss a way to get questions from our advocates to you. We'll figure out a way because we have to end it exactly 5 minutes.
Oh, okay. Then let me just skip to climate change. Okay, so sorry, I thought I had like an hour for some reason. But okay, so climate change and mental health. So climate change can impact mental health through multiple ways. So I think this is a very helpful framework for people to approach it. You have the geophysical change, that is the temperature, natural disasters themselves that would have being a stressor that lead to increased PTSD, depression, and anxiety, or they act indirectly through exacerbation of economic and social stressors that make people more likely and more prone to these clinical problems. But the perception of risks themselves also have impact, as we see a rise in climate anxiety, especially among youth, even though for people who are lucky and are relatively more protected from the adverse health outcomes, either because they have adequate housing that protect them from heat event, or they found out early enough that they were able to evacuate during before a natural disaster really hit. But the worry and stress that comes with that still has its manifestation. So there's extensive evidence on mental health related hospitalization after a natural disaster event, but I do want to flag that most of them are in developed country. You don't really see a lot of research in developing country, either because of research funding constraints or just the fact that you don't have a lot of validated screening tools to identify people with these kind of conditions. You also see, this is true in some developed countries as well, that you have very scarce mental health services. So people, even with very serious mental health conditions, they don't go to healthcare systems. So the current estimate is definitely an underestimate because you don't catch everyone who are actually impacted in this way. And for youth who are suffering from climate anxiety, even though this is not currently listed as a clinical condition as serious as depression and anxiety that would need like medication intervention, we still recognize it as a adverse factor for people's well-being. Several terms have been coined to help people name what they are feeling. So first of all, it's ecological grief. That is the grief felt in relation to the experience or anticipated ecological losses. And solastalgia, that is the distress produced by environmental change impacting on people, while they're directly connected to their home environment. And this solastalgia term is often used to kind of describe the disruption in the connection between human and land among indigenous people as they kind of process and grieve the loss of their home in this way. And lastly, climate anxiety, that is anxiety or worry felt about climate change and its effects. So there is the research on climate anxiety is still very nascent, but a very recent survey of 10,000 youth in 10 countries really revealed that a lot of young people are very worried about climate change. So the figure 1 here shows that. So for purple, is for a proportion of people not worried, and for green is for people a little worried. You can see that there's the majority of youth surveyed reported feeling concerned about climate change. And in this way, on average, almost half of them feel like that impacts their daily functioning. And as a response to kind of identify what are the factors that kind of really induce people's climate anxiety, and also identify ways that we can target to make people feel less hopeless. The survey designer also as kind of like people's feeling of reassurance or betrayal relating to government responses to climate change, which reveals that a lot of young people are surveyed were not really happy about government level actions. But this can be played and interpreted into both ways as even though the current got like system level actions are lacking, it still points to an opportunity for young people to take matter into their own hand because um, as as people grow up, you are more likely to um, experience these exposure or exacerbation of health outcomes that we just went over, and this is an opportunity for you to think about ways to protect yourselves, your future, and also ways to collaborate with each other to empower and encourage people like yourselves to work on things together and you know build communities in this very challenging environment. Some of the research has shown that even though sometimes people say that they are very concerned about climate change, but they don't feel as um, anxious. And it's because they have this coping mechanism that is focused on like meaning making. So instead of feeling or hopeful that may or may not be turning into wishful thinking, it's more important for people to make sense of what's happening and identify a way that they could work on it to turn it into something that is more meaningful and more significant in this way rather than just this wishful thinking. So yeah,
Thank
so
you.
yeah.
So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna share the PDF of the entire presentation. And I know some of you have questions and of course reflections and responses. And I will start tomorrow's session with a discussion and taking questions and reflections on this presentation. That was really comprehensive, really meaningful. And I know Cynthia from our first session yesterday, many advocates brought up eco-anxiety. They also mentioned a lot of the health impacts that they're seeing in their community. So this is very relevant to really put the meat to kind of what they're seeing in the firsthand lived experience. Thank you so much, everyone. We have to sign off, but we will start tomorrow's session reflecting on this presentation and the other presentations we had today. Thank you and have a wonderful day. Thank you so much, Cynthia. Thank you. Bye.
Okay.